The document spread across the desk of Caldwell County's land office was not a mistake. Nellie Quinn had read it 3 times, her finger tracing every line with the precision of a woman who had taught herself contract law from borrowed books by candlelight. The deed bore her name. The signature at the bottom, however, was not hers. "You forged it." Her voice did not shake. That was the thing about Nellie Quinn. Even when the floor was falling out from under her, her voice never shook. "You forged my deed transfer and sold my claim to the Hargrove Mining Consortium without my knowledge or my consent." Jasper Crane, the land registrar for Caldwell County, Kansas, was a small man with large ambitions and the moral compass of a weather vane in a tornado. He leaned back in his chair with the casual confidence of someone who had done this before and gotten away with it before. "Miss Quinn, I don't know what you think you're reading, but that document is perfectly legal. Your signature is right there. Are you suggesting your own memory has failed you?" "I'm suggesting your pen failed your conscience," Nellie said. She placed both palms flat on the desk and leaned toward him, close enough that he could see her eyes were not frightened. They were furious. "I have been farming that quarter section for 14 months. I broke that ground. I built that water channel. I planted winter wheat in soil everybody in this county told me a woman alone couldn't farm, and you sold it out from under me." Crane's expression shifted then just slightly from amusement to something colder. "Women don't file homestead claims in Caldwell County, not alone. It's not the custom. It's the law," Nellie said. "The Homestead Act of 1862 does not specify gender. Laws and customs are different things out here, Miss Quinn. Then I suppose we'll find out which one this territory respects." It was at exactly that moment that the door to the land office opened, and Raymond Thatcher walked in. He did not know he was walking into the beginning of everything. He only knew he needed to file an irrigation permit for the Thatcher Ranch's eastern pasture before the county closed for the afternoon. He stopped 3 steps inside the door and read the room the way a man reads weather, quickly, accurately, and with genuine concern for what it might mean. He saw the woman. He saw Crane's expression. He saw the document on the desk. He stayed. To understand how Nellie Quinn arrived at a land office in Caldwell County, Kansas on a June afternoon in 1874, with forgery accusations on her tongue and fire in her eyes, you had to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of that day, but the beginning of her. Nellie had been born in Philadelphia in 1849, the second of 4 children to a schoolteacher father and a mother who sewed piecework for a garment manufacturer until her fingers bled. Her father, Thomas Quinn, believed in education with the same fervor other men believed in Scripture. He taught all 4 of his children to read, to argue, and to question. He taught Nellie in particular because Nellie was the one who would not stop asking why. Why could women not vote? Why did the deed to the house bear only her father's name when her mother had worked to pay for it? Why did the school her father taught at refuse to hire women for anything above the primary grades? Thomas Quinn gave her honest answers when he had them and uncomfortable silences when he did not, and Nellie learned that the silence was often the most instructive response of all. She was 22 when her father died of a fever that swept through Philadelphia in the autumn of 1871. She was 23 when her mother, grief-broken and exhausted, moved in with Nellie's older brother and his wife in a small house in New Jersey that had no room for surplus daughters. She was 24 when she read a notice in the Philadelphia Inquirer about the Homestead Act and land grants in the territories of Kansas. The notice was written for men. Most things were. But the law itself, as Nellie had discovered through careful reading of the actual congressional text, was not. Any person who was the head of a family or who had reached 21 years of age and was a citizen of the United States could file. Person. The word was person. Nellie Quinn was a person. She arrived in Caldwell, Kansas in April of 1873, with $73 saved from 3 years of work as a copyist for a Philadelphia law firm, 2 trunks of practical clothing, a crate of books, a set of quality hand tools, and a stubbornness that the women on the westbound train found either inspiring or alarming depending on their disposition. She filed her homestead claim on a quarter section of raw prairie 2 miles southeast of the town and began the business of building a life. The first year was honest brutality. Prairie soil fought the plow with the resistance of something that had never been asked to yield. She hired a broken-down old plowman named Willis Dent for the first turning of the ground, spending money she could barely afford, and then she managed everything after that herself. She built a one-room soddy with the help of her nearest neighbor, a Mennonite woman named Hannah Brower, whose husband made it clear he thought the whole enterprise was foolishness, but who helped anyway because Hannah asked him to. Nellie dug her water channel by hand over the course of 6 weeks, following the lay of the land the way Willis Dent had taught her, feeling the grade with her feet and her instincts. By the second spring she had winter wheat in the ground and a small kitchen garden near the soddy, and a reputation in Caldwell that depended entirely on who you asked. The women at the dry goods store admired her. The men at the feed merchant debated her. Jasper Crane, it turned out, was watching her with an entirely different category of interest, the kind that involved maps and money and a quiet arrangement with the Hargrove Mining Consortium, which had recently received credible reports of a significant coal seam running under the southeastern quarter sections of Caldwell County. Nellie's land sat directly above the richest part of it. She did not know any of this when she walked into the land office that June afternoon to register her crop yield report, which was required for federal homestead verification. She found out all of it at once, in the worst possible way, from the worst possible person. Raymond Thatcher had lived in Kansas his whole life. He was 30 years old in the summer of 1874, the third generation of Thatchers to work the land around Caldwell. His grandfather had come out from Tennessee before the war and homesteaded with a stubbornness that apparently ran in the family. His father had expanded the ranch to nearly 800 acres before his death 4 years ago, and Raymond had been running it since then, which meant he had been 32,000 pounds of responsibility carrying itself around on a lean frame with careful brown eyes and hands that knew how to work. He had never thought much about what women could and could not do. That was not because he was progressive in any deliberate philosophical sense. It was simply because he had watched his mother run the ranch accounts, negotiate with suppliers, and make decisions his father respected, and it had never occurred to him to imagine the world working any other way. His mother, Margaret Thatcher, was 61 years old and still came to the ranch twice a week to review the books, and Raymond had never once suggested she stop. He had not been looking for a wife. He was not the kind of man who thought about it strategically. He had understood from watching other men that marriage was either a partnership or a slow misery, and he was not interested in the misery version, and the partnership version had not yet presented itself to him in a form that seemed real. What he saw in the Caldwell land office on that June afternoon was a woman who was not backing down. "I'll ask again," Nellie was saying, when he was deciding whether to leave and come back tomorrow or stay and see what he could offer. "Where is the money from the sale? If the transaction was legal, as you claim, then the proceeds should have been deposited to my account at the First Bank of Caldwell." Crane's face had gone to stone. "Proceeds from a mineral rights transaction are handled through the consortium directly." "Which means through you," Nellie said. "You filed the mineral rights separately from the surface claim and sold them without disclosing the existence of the coal survey to me, which is fraud, Mr. Crane. That is not a custom. That is a crime." Raymond stepped forward. He did not plan to speak. The words simply came out because the situation was clear and he did not see the value of pretending otherwise. "She's right about that." Both of them looked at him, Crane with sharp, suspicious eyes, Nellie with a measuring look that was neither welcoming nor dismissive, just accurate. "Raymond Thatcher," he said, because introduction seemed appropriate. "My family has been filing land documents in this office for 23 years, Mr. Crane." I know what a mineral rights severance filing looks like, and I know it requires the surface claimant's notarized consent. That signature needs to be verified by a notary other than yourself before this office can consider it valid. Crane said nothing. I'd recommend, Raymond continued, keeping his voice completely level, that you hold all transactions related to this claim until an independent notary reviews the signature. Otherwise, you're looking at a federal investigation, and those tend to turn up all sorts of interesting things. The silence in the land office was the specific kind that meant someone was calculating whether their position was still tenable. It was not. I'll hold the transaction pending review, Crane said, finally. His voice was flat with the sound of a man saving himself. Nellie looked at Raymond with an expression he could not entirely read. It was not gratitude exactly. It was something more complicated than gratitude. I had that handled, she said. I know you did, Raymond said, and meant it completely. They walked out of the land office together into the hot, bright Kansas afternoon, and the strange thing was that it felt entirely natural, even though they were strangers. Nellie Quinn, she said, extending her hand. Her handshake was firm and businesslike, the handshake of a person who had learned to do it correctly because she knew it mattered how you presented yourself. I know who you are, Raymond said. You're farming the southeast quarter on County Road 8. Winter wheat, you dug your own water channel. She looked at him differently then. Not softly, Nellie Quinn did not do anything softly at first, but with a kind of recalibration. Most people in this county know me as either a curiosity or a problem. I know you as a farmer, Raymond said simply. Your wheat looked good at the spring assessment, better than good. Nellie Quinn had not expected that. She had expected many things from the men of Caldwell County: condescension, amusement, sometimes grudging tolerance. She had not expected to be called a farmer the same way you'd call a man a farmer, like it was just a fact. I need a lawyer, she said, because the more immediate crisis was still sitting in the land office behind them, and she could not afford to be distracted by the unexpected pleasantness of a man who spoke to her plainly. Nearest good one is Judge Warren Peters in Wichita, Raymond said. But before you spend the money on that, I'd talk to Hannah Brower's husband first. Ernst Brower was a notary public in Ohio before he came west. He's gruff about it, but he's honest. Ernst Brower helped me build my soddy, Nellie said, with a flicker of something that might have been amusement. He said the whole enterprise was foolishness. Did he finish the soddy? He did. Then he respects you even if he won't say it. Ernst Brower doesn't finish things he thinks are actually foolish. Nellie was quiet for a moment, standing on the dusty boardwalk in the June heat with this man she did not know who had just done something useful without making it theatrical. Why did you step in back there? Raymond thought about that honestly. Because what was happening was wrong and I was in a position to say something about it. I don't need a more complicated reason than that. She looked at him for a long moment. Most men would have wanted something in return for that. I'm not most men, he said, and it was not a boast. It was just a statement of fact, delivered the same way he'd said everything else. She decided, in that moment, that she believed him. She also decided she could not afford to think about why that decision felt more significant than it probably should. Ernst Brower was in his barn when Nellie and Raymond arrived at the Brower farm that afternoon, which sat roughly a mile and a half north of Nellie's homestead. He was a broad man with an enormous beard, and the kind of practical efficiency in all his movements that suggested he had never once in his life done anything decoratively. He listened to Nellie's account of the land office without interrupting, which was more than most men had ever given her. Crane has done this before, Brower said when she had finished. Not the forgery, but the arrangement with Hargrove. He sold Amos Teller's mineral rights 2 years ago. Teller never fought it because he did not know he could. I know I can, Nellie said. Brower looked at Raymond. Did you tell her about Peters in Wichita? I did. She'll need him eventually. But the notary question I can handle myself. He looked at Nellie with the expression of a man who had called something foolish and been made to acknowledge he was wrong, though he would not say it directly. I'll come to the land office tomorrow morning and examine the signature. If it is forged, I will write an affidavit stating so. That affidavit will be enough to block the transfer and open a fraud inquiry." Nellie said, "Thank you, Mr. Brower." He grunted. Hannah Brower appeared from the house then with a pitcher of water and 2 extra cups, with the serene competence of a woman who had anticipated the need before it was expressed. She smiled at Nellie with genuine warmth. "You'll stay for supper," she said, and it was not a question. They stayed for supper. It was at the Brower table, over roasted chicken and bread, and a conversation that moved easily between the practical and the personal, that Nellie began to understand Raymond Thatcher as something other than the unexpected man who had stepped in at the land office. He talked about the ranch with a kind of quiet pride that was not boastfulness, more like honest respect for a thing he worked hard to be worthy of. He talked about his mother with obvious affection. He asked Nellie questions about her wheat crop that were genuinely knowledgeable, and when she answered he listened with actual attention, rather than the polite performance of listening she had learned to recognize as its own kind of dismissal. Hannah Brower watched them both with an expression she kept carefully neutral, but her eyes were doing something different from her face. Riding back toward her homestead in the long summer dusk, Nellie caught herself replaying pieces of the conversation and made herself stop. There was a fraud case to build. There was a land office to contend with. There was a coal seam under her property that apparently made her quarter section suddenly very valuable, which meant the pressure was not going to stop with Crane being corrected. The Hargrove Mining Consortium was not a small operation. It had lawyers and money, and the kind of patience that came from having both. She needed to be focused. She needed to be strategic. She could not afford to be distracted by a man with careful brown eyes who called her a farmer. Raymond rode beside her most of the way because his route home passed her property. Neither of them said much. The Kansas sky at dusk was enormous and streaked with color, and the prairie was still and warm, and somewhere a meadowlark was making the specific sound that Nellie had come to associate with the feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be, even in the middle of all the difficulty. "Your wheat will be ready to cut in about 3 weeks," Raymond said. "I know," she said. "Do you have labor arranged?" She had been worrying about that for a month. Harvest required more hands than she had, and hiring harvest labor meant money she was uncertain she had available given that her finances had been recently disrupted by the discovery that her land was possibly being sold out from under her. "I'm working on it," she said, which was not quite a lie. "I have 2 ranch hands who have experience with wheat harvest. If you need extra help, I can ask them. I would pay them." "Of course," Raymond said, as if the question of payment was obvious and he would not have suggested it otherwise. She said, "You do this kind of thing often. Show up and be useful at exactly the right moment." He thought about it. "I show up," he said. "The useful part I try for," she laughed. It was the first time she had laughed since walking into the land office that morning and finding her life's work forged away from her. The laugh surprised her, and from the slight shift in Raymond's expression, she thought it might have surprised him too, in a good way. They reached the turning point where the road divided, his way east, her south, and stopped. "Thank you," she said. "For today, for the land office." She paused. "I had it handled." "You did," he said. "I was just one more voice saying the same thing you were already saying." She looked at him. "That's not nothing. Having someone say the same thing alongside you, instead of talking over you." "No," he agreed. "It's not nothing." She rode home in the dusk and did not replay the conversation. She replayed it anyway. Ernst Brower appeared at the Caldwell land office at 8 o'clock the following morning with his notary seal and the precise, implacable air of a man who had spent 20 years in legal documentation, and was not intimidated by Jasper Crane or anyone affiliated with the Hargrove Mining Consortium. Nellie was there with him. Raymond was not, which she told herself she was not aware of and then noticed she was aware of. The examination took 40 minutes. Brower's verdict was unambiguous and delivered in a voice designed to carry across the room to the 2 clerks who were pretending to be absorbed in their ledgers. The signature was not Nellie Quinn's. The letter formation of the capital Q was demonstrably different from the signatures on her original homestead filing. The notarization stamp had been applied using a seal registered to a notary in Sedgwick County who, when contacted, would almost certainly deny ever having seen this document. The entire transaction was fraudulent. Crane's face went through several colors. Brower filed the affidavit. The transaction was suspended. Crane was informed that the affidavit would be forwarded to the Federal Land Office in Topeka for investigation. Crane said nothing, which was the loudest thing he could have said. Outside on the boardwalk afterward, Nellie realized her hands were shaking very slightly, not from fear, from the specific physical release of sustained tension, the way a rope shakes when you finally set down the weight you have been carrying with it for too long. "It is not finished," Brower told her. "Hargrove will try another approach. They have lawyers. You should write to Peters in Wichita this week." "I will," she said. She meant it. She was already composing the letter in her head. Brower gave her another long look, the measuring kind. "You are not what I expected," he said, which from Ernst Brower was clearly as close to a compliment as his vocabulary permitted. "Most people have not known what to expect from me," Nellie said. "I find it useful." She did write to Judge Warren Peters that evening, sitting at the small table in her soddy with a candle and her best writing paper, laying out the facts of the forgery case with the clarity and precision her years in the law office had given her. The letter was 12 pages long. She reread it twice, cut it to 8 pages, and sent it the next morning. The response came 11 days later, and it was not a letter. Warren Peters came himself, arriving in Caldwell on the afternoon stage with a leather briefcase and the expression of a man who had read something interesting. He was 63 years old, compact, sharp-eyed, and had spent 40 years practicing law across Kansas and Missouri. He had seen forgery cases before. He had not, he told Nellie plainly, seen one documented with the initial clarity of hers. "You did this yourself?" he asked, reviewing her notes at her kitchen table with a cup of strong coffee that she had made properly, because she had learned that Peters appreciated strong coffee and basic competence. "I worked as a copyist in a Philadelphia law firm for 3 years, she said. "I paid attention," Peters smiled. It was a brief smile, but genuine. "Hargrove's lawyers are good," he said, "but they made the mistake of assuming you would not be." The case against Jasper Crane moved forward over the following weeks with the momentum of a thing that had been documented carefully from the start. Peters filed the fraud petition in Topeka. The Federal Land Office opened an investigation. Crane, it turned out under that investigation, had arranged 5 similar transactions over 4 years, selling mineral rights from homestead claims to the Hargrove Consortium using forged documents. 3 of those original claimants were still alive and in the county. Peters contacted them all. What had started as Nellie Quinn defending her own land became something larger, a formal fraud case that would eventually result in Crane's removal from office, the invalidation of all 5 forged transactions, and a federal court ruling that reaffirmed the rights of all 5 claimants. It took 8 months from start to finish. During those 8 months, Nellie harvested her wheat, which came in at a yield that made Willis Dent nod with slow, genuine respect when she told him. She replanted with winter rye. She expanded her water channel by 30 feet. She bought a better plow with money from the wheat sale. She also, almost without intending to, spent a great deal of time with Raymond Thatcher. It began practically. He had offered the harvest hands as promised, and when cutting time came in late July, 2 of his men arrived on Monday morning with their own scythes and a curt instruction from Raymond that they were to follow Miss Quinn's directions because it was her farm and she knew it. This was not nothing. Nellie had spent too many months having men arrive to help with a quiet assumption of authority she had not granted and had to politely dismantle. Raymond's instruction removed that obstacle before it formed. He came by himself on the 3rd day, not to manage but to work. He simply showed up at 6 in the morning with his own scythe and a canteen and started cutting alongside his men and Nellie without ceremony or explanation. When she looked at him with a questioning expression, he said, "Harvest is faster with another person," which was true and also clearly not the entire truth. By noon, they had cut most of the western field. By evening, they had finished. Nellie made a supper of salt pork and beans and cornbread that was simple and very good, and the four of them ate it in the shade of the storage shed she had built the previous autumn. And then Raymond's men rode back to the Thatcher ranch, and Raymond stayed a little longer because the conversation did not seem to be finished. "Tell me why you came west," he said. They were sitting on the bench outside the soddy with the evening coming down around them, the sky going deep blue above the flat dark line of the horizon. She told him the honest version, which she did not usually tell because the honest version required a certain kind of listening that most people did not provide. The death of her father, the borrowed legal texts, the word person in the Homestead Act, the specific feeling of reading that word and understanding what it could mean for a woman who was tired of waiting for the world to grant her a space that the law already guaranteed. He listened without interrupting. He asked one question at the end. "Are you glad you came?" She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. The loneliness of the first winter, which had been a specific and heavy loneliness that she had not anticipated despite having been alone before. The physical difficulty of the work, which she had anticipated and still sometimes underestimated. The condescension of Caldwell County's more entrenched residents, Crane's betrayal, and on the other side, the wheat coming in gold and heavy in July, the meadowlarks, Hannah Brower's friendship, the specific feeling of standing on ground that was hers, documented and legally established, ground she had cultivated with her own hands. "Yes," she said, "even with all of it, yes." Raymond looked at the horizon. "I've never been anywhere else," he said. "Born here, will likely die here. I used to think that was a small thing. Lately, I think maybe it's not about how much ground you cover but about how deep you go." She looked at him. "That is either very wise or very convenient." He laughed. She liked his laugh. It was genuine and a little surprised, like laughter he had not planned on, which was her favorite kind. The weeks passed in this way, full of practical work and small conversations, and the gradual accumulation of shared reference that becomes the architecture of a close friendship before it becomes anything else. He stopped by the homestead twice a week on his way to or from town. They fell into the habit of talking for an hour in the evenings, sometimes about the land case, sometimes about the ranch, sometimes about the book she was reading, which she had not talked to anyone about since Philadelphia because the women in Caldwell were kind but not interested in the same things, and the men either were not interested or pretended to be in a way that was more about impression than actual engagement. Raymond was interested in the actual books. He had not had much formal schooling, but he had read steadily and independently the way people do when they are genuinely curious rather than performing education. He had opinions about books, and he disagreed with Nellie sometimes in ways that were real disagreements rather than the deferential non-arguments she often received from men who thought agreeing with a woman was the same as respecting her. One evening in September, sitting outside with a lantern between them and a copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch that Nellie had been rereading, they argued for 40 minutes about Dorothea Brooke's choices and whether they constituted self-determination or self-defeat. And at the end of it, Nellie realized she had not argued this passionately about a book since her father's kitchen table, and something in that realization made her chest feel tight in a way she was not ready to name. She named it to herself 3 days later, at 4 in the morning when she could not sleep, lying in the dark of her soddy listening to the wind across the prairie and being rigorously honest with herself the way she had promised herself she would always be. She was falling in love with Raymond Thatcher. She had been falling in love with him for weeks, probably since the harvest at least, and possibly since the land office, which was a dangerously short time to know a person and also apparently not short enough to prevent it. The thing was, she did not know what to do with it. Nellie Quinn had come west to be independent. She had come west precisely because she had watched what happened to women who oriented their entire existence around a man and found it insufficient for their particular soul. She had come west to own land and work it and answer to herself. She believed in that with her whole mind. And now here was Raymond Thatcher, who did not ask her to be anything other than what she was, who had never once suggested she needed managing or saving or steering, who called her a farmer and meant it and argued with her about novels and meant that too, and she did not know how to hold the two things together, the independence she had built and the feeling she had not asked for. She thought about it for several days with the focused intensity she brought to every serious problem. She thought about what dependence meant and what it did not have to mean. She thought about her parents, who had been a genuine partnership in the middle years before grief and exhaustion overtook them. She thought about Hannah and Ernst Brower, who were clearly two separate and capable people who had chosen each other. She thought about what Raymond had said about how deep you go versus how much ground you cover, and she thought about depth in a different context entirely. She also thought, with the practical honesty that was her truest habit of mind, that she did not know what he felt. She had read the evenings as mutual, but she had been wrong about people before, and she was aware that her tendency to analyze situations carefully did not immunize her from misreading the ones that mattered most to her. She decided to pay attention rather than assume. What she noticed, once she was paying careful, deliberate attention, was that Raymond's twice-weekly route past her homestead had gradually become more frequent. That he had begun finding reasons to be in the same general neighborhood of the county. That when they talked, he gave her his full attention in a way that was not generically polite but specifically focused, the way you focus on a person whose words matter to you. That when she mentioned something difficult, the land case, a rough week, a doubt she was working through, he did not immediately try to fix it, but instead asked questions that helped her think it through herself, which was the most respectful thing anyone could do for her and also the hardest thing to find. She noticed that when she laughed, he looked at her as if the laugh was something he was glad to have caused. In late October, Warren Peters came back to Caldwell with the news that the federal court had ruled in her favor. The deed was confirmed. The mineral rights reattached to the surface claim under her name. Crane was removed from office, and the fraud case was proceeding to a criminal proceeding that Peters expected would result in conviction. Nellie sat with this news at Peters's side in the courthouse anteroom and felt the specific satisfaction of a thing resolved that had cost everything she had to resolve. Peters said, "You should know that Hargrove will probably approach you directly now, with an offer to purchase the mineral rights legally. They'll offer you real money." "How much?" Nellie asked, which was the practical question. Peters named a figure that made her understand, for the first time, the actual size of what was under her land. She said, "I'll think about it." Peters looked at her with the expression of a man who had seen a lot of people receive large sums of money and watched it make them do things they regretted. "Think carefully," he said. She did. She spent a week thinking carefully, running numbers in her head and on paper at her small table by candlelight. The figure Hargrove had preliminarily suggested through Peters was more money than her family had seen in 3 generations. It was also money that would come in exchange for the coal under her land, not the land itself. She could keep the surface claim, keep farming. She would have enough capital to invest properly in the farm, to buy better equipment, to hire regular help, to expand. The question was whether coal mining under her land was something she wanted, and that was a question that had dimensions she had not fully considered, until she spent 2 hours one afternoon walking the edges of her quarter section, looking at the soil and the winter rye she had planted and thinking about what this land meant to her beyond its monetary value. She was standing at the northwest corner of her property, looking south across her field, when she heard Raymond's horse on the road and turned to see him slowing down and then stopping when he saw her standing there looking at her land. He did not ask what she was thinking. He just dismounted and came to stand beside her and looked at the same thing she was looking at, which was the land itself, the winter rye starting to show, green against the dark soil in the October light. "Peters told me about the offer," she said. "I heard," he said. "In a county of 2,000 people, everyone heard things. What are you going to do?" "I haven't decided," she said. "I'm still working out what I value more, the certainty the money would give me or the undisturbed state of the land." He nodded. He did not offer an opinion, which she noticed and appreciated. "What would you do," she asked, "with coal under your ranch? If someone offered you that kind of money for the mineral rights?" Raymond thought about it honestly, the way he thought about everything. "I'd probably say no," he said, "because I know what mining does to land, and the ranch has been in my family for 3 generations, and I think about the 4th generation too." He paused. "But my situation is different from yours. You've been here 14 months. You built this alone. You defended it alone. You get to decide what it means to you without anyone else's history in the soil." Nellie was quiet for a moment. "The 4th generation," she said. "Do you think about that? A family to come after you?" He looked at her. She was looking at her field, but she was aware of his gaze with the specific awareness you have for someone you are trying not to look at directly. "I do," he said. "More lately." She turned and looked at him. He met her eyes. The October light was low and clear, and the rye was green in the dark field behind her, and the prairie wind was doing something very quiet. "Raymond," she said. "Nellie," he said at the same moment. They both stopped. There was a pause that was the kind of pause that exists when 2 people are suddenly in the same place at the same time, and both of them know it, and neither of them is quite sure what to do with the recognition. "I have something to say to you," Nellie said, because she was not a woman who waited when she knew what she meant to do. "And I want to say it clearly, because I think you deserve clarity, and I think I deserve the chance to be honest about it rather than letting it be something that just happens sideways." Raymond waited. His expression was open and entirely attentive. "I have been falling in love with you," she said. "I have been aware of it for about 6 weeks, and I have been very rigorously honest with myself about whether it is what I think it is, and I believe it is. I also believe that you feel something similar, but I could be wrong about that, and I would rather ask directly and be wrong than operate from an assumption." Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are not wrong about that," she exhaled. "Good," she said. "That's good." He smiled. She had learned by now that his smiles came in different varieties, and the one he was wearing was the one she liked most, the one that started slowly and reached his eyes last and stayed there. "I want to be honest about something too," he said. "I have watched you work and fight for this land and build something real here from nothing and defend it against people who tried to take it from you, and I don't think I have ever admired anyone more in my life. And that admiration, it is not separate from the rest of it. It is not in spite of who you are. It is because of it." Nellie Quinn, who had been called many things by many people in her 25 years, and who had learned very early not to need approval but had never quite stopped feeling the difference between recognition and condescension, stood in her own field in the October light, and felt something in her chest that she did not have a word for. Something that was not weakness and not softness in any diminishing sense, but rather the specific feeling of being seen accurately by someone who was paying genuine attention. "I came west to be independent," she said. "I know," Raymond said. "That's not something I'm putting aside." "I know that too," he said. "I would not ask you to." She looked at him for a long moment, reading his face with the careful accuracy she brought to everything important. What she saw there was consistent with what she had come to know over the past months. A man who was exactly what he appeared to be, which was not nothing. In a world full of hidden motives and carefully managed surfaces, a person who was genuinely what they presented was an extraordinary thing. "Then I would like to keep talking," she said, "about all of it, about what it would mean, about what we both want and what we both need and how it might work or not work." "I would like that too," he said. They walked the edge of her property in the October afternoon. talking about everything about independence and partnership, and what each of them actually meant when they used those words, which turned out to be similar enough to be hopeful and different enough in small ways to be genuinely interesting. About the land and the ranch and the farm and how a life could hold more than one kind of thing. About children, which Nellie raised herself directly, because she was not going to pretend the question did not exist. She wanted children, she said, and she wanted them to be raised to know they could do and be things, and she wanted the people who raised them to believe that too, which was not a small qualification. Raymond said he wanted children, and he thought the thing you owed them most was honesty and example, and that example was the part he thought hardest about. He said he had watched his father run a ranch for 30 years, and the thing he had learned most from him was not the ranching. It was the way he had listened to Margaret Thatcher's opinions, as if they carried real weight, because they did. The sun went down on that conversation, and they kept talking in the dark, and eventually the stars came out over the Kansas prairie, enormous and dense and very close, and Nellie looked up at them and thought about the first night she had spent on this land, in a tent before the soddy was built, when the sky had been exactly this, and she had been so frightened and so fiercely certain at the same time, and how all of it had led here, to this field, to this conversation, to this man standing beside her in the dark looking up at the same stars. Winter came with the slow deliberateness of Kansas winters, which were not gradual. The cold arrived in late November with a sharp finality, and the days shortened to a narrow strip of gray light between long stretches of dark. The rye was in the ground. The soddy was well insulated from the previous winter's improvements. Nellie had oil for the lamps and enough provisions laid in for 3 months of hard weather. She and Raymond had continued talking, as they had agreed. It was not a slow courtship in the sense of carefully managed formality. It was something more honest than that, a series of real conversations in which they established real knowledge of each other, with the kind of directness that comes when two people have both been through enough to understand that indirection is a waste of limited time. He came to supper at the soddy 3 times a week through November and December, riding the 2 miles from the Thatcher ranch in the cold, with a matter-of-factness that said he had decided this was worth it, and the cold was just weather. They talked over meals and over books and over the ranch accounts, which he began bringing because she had a natural facility for numbers that he was glad to use, and which gave her an understanding of the ranch's finances that would have been considered inappropriate for a woman who was merely being courted, but was entirely appropriate for a woman who was being approached as a potential partner in a genuine sense. Margaret Thatcher came to the homestead one afternoon in December with a cake and an expression of calm assessment. She was a trim, upright woman of 61 with silver hair and very direct brown eyes that had clearly passed to her son. She sat in Nellie's kitchen and ate cake and looked at everything with the specific attention of a person who is deciding whether another person is real. "Raymond tells me you handled the Crane affair largely yourself," Margaret said. "Mr. Brower and Mr. Peters helped considerably," Nellie said. "Raymond said you had it handled before they arrived." "Largely," Nellie said. Margaret looked at her for a moment. "My son needs someone who will hold their own," she said. "He has good instincts, but he is the kind of man who needs to be argued with sometimes, or he will be too comfortable. He won't argue with someone who won't argue back." "I have never had difficulty arguing," Nellie said. Margaret smiled. It was Raymond's smile, delayed and genuine. "No," she said, "I can see that." She finished her cake. "Good." It was, apparently, an approval. It was also, Nellie thought, the most honest assessment of a potential relationship she had ever been offered, and she respected it enormously. Raymond asked Nellie to marry him in February of 1875, 3 months into the formal courtship, which was fast by the standards of some people, and not fast enough by the standards of others, and exactly the right pace by the standards of 2 people who had spent those months talking about precisely what marriage would mean rather than dancing around the subject. He did it without theater, which was consistent with everything she knew about him. They were at her kitchen table with a snowstorm hitting the outside of the soddy and a good fire in the stove and coffee between them, and he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever your answer is, I'll respect it and it won't change anything between us." She said, "Ask." He said, "I would like to marry you if you're willing. Not because I think you need someone, because you clearly don't. Because I think we are both better, more complete, more genuinely ourselves in each other's company than we are separately, and I think that is the real reason to do it. I want to be your partner. I want to build something with you, and I want to spend the next 50 years arguing about books and farming and whatever else presents itself." Nellie Quinn sat across the table from Raymond Thatcher in the middle of a Kansas snowstorm in February of 1875 and understood, with the clear-eyed honesty that had always been her best trait, that this was exactly what she had come west for: not a man, not rescue, not completion in the sense of fixing something broken. She had come west for the life she had chosen and built on her own terms, and that life was real and whole and hers. What Raymond was offering was not to take that away or fold it into something of his. He was offering to set his life beside hers and see what they could build together from two strong and different starting points. She said, "Yes, and then because she was Nellie Quinn, I have some conditions." He smiled the real smile. "Of course you do." The conditions were these: the homestead remained in her name. The farm operated as her enterprise and the ranch as his, with shared decisions on anything that affected both and financial transparency between them. Any children they had would be raised to know that independence was not a luxury, but a moral requirement of a good life. He would not speak for her in business or legal matters unless explicitly asked. She would not speak for him either, which was offered as equality rather than merely reciprocity. Raymond agreed to all of it without hesitation, which told her what she already knew, that he had been thinking about the same things and arrived at the same place. They were married in April of 1875 in the small Presbyterian church in Caldwell, in a ceremony that was simple and direct, presided over by the minister Reverend Hale and attended by Margaret Thatcher, Hannah and Ernst Brower, Warren Peters, who made a special trip from Wichita, Willis Dent, who dressed up more formally than anyone had ever seen him, and most of the county's farming families, a number of whom came partly because the wedding was an event, and partly because Nellie Quinn's story had traveled across the county over the past year, and people had opinions about it in the best possible way. The ceremony included vows that Nellie had written herself, which were not the standard vows of the period. They were specific. They named what she and Raymond were promising each other in language that was clear and meant to be kept. Reverend Hale read them without objection, which suggested that he was either broad-minded or wise enough to understand that these were promises that had a better chance of being honored because of how carefully they had been chosen. They moved into the Thatcher ranch house together, which was more practical than the soddy, though Nellie kept the homestead land and worked it regularly with help. She hired 2 people full-time for the farm, a young woman named Clara Sutter who had farming experience and the practical intelligence Nellie valued, and an older man named George Hennessy who had grown up farming in Iowa and knew wheat the way some people knew music. The integration of her life with Raymond's was not seamless, because real things are rarely seamless. There were adjustments. There were 3 serious arguments in the first 6 months, each of which was about something substantive. Once about a financial decision Raymond made regarding the ranch without consulting her, which she called a violation of their agreement, and which he acknowledged genuinely and corrected. Once about how she was approaching a conflict with a neighboring rancher over water rights, where she thought she was being direct, and he thought she was being adversarial in a way that would close doors they might need open. And they argued through both positions and arrived at a third approach together that worked better than either original, and once about something small that neither of them could quite remember the origins of 2 days later, which was actually reassuring rather than concerning, because it meant the serious arguments were about real things, and the small arguments were survivable. What persisted steadily, through the adjustments and the arguments and the daily work of two lives being woven together, was a quality of attention they paid each other that was the real thing underneath everything else. Raymond saw Nellie clearly, and she saw him clearly, and they had both, from the beginning, chosen each other with open eyes. That was the foundation that held everything else up. The Crane criminal case concluded in the summer of 1875, resulting in a conviction on 5 counts of fraud and the sentencing of Jasper Crane to 4 years in the federal penitentiary. Warren Peters wrote to Nellie with the news and a brief, elegant note that said simply, "Well done. The other 4 claimants thank you." She read the letter at her kitchen table at the ranch with Raymond's hand on her shoulder, and she sat with the feeling of it for a long moment. The Hargrove Mining Consortium made a formal offer for the mineral rights to her property in August of that year. It was a substantial offer, clearly designed to be difficult to refuse. Nellie and Raymond sat with Peters over 2 days in Wichita and negotiated. What emerged was not a simple sale. It was an agreement that gave Hargrove the right to mine the coal under a specific section of the property, under conditions that Nellie specified, conditions that included restoration requirements for any surface disruption, a royalty payment per ton of coal extracted that significantly exceeded the initial offer, and a 10-year term after which the rights reverted unless renegotiated. It was a better deal than anyone had expected to get from a consortium with that much legal power, and Peters told her afterward that it was the best mineral rights agreement he had seen negotiated by an individual claimant in his career. The royalty income that began arriving quarterly from the coal mining operation changed the financial landscape of Nellie's farm, and by extension, the ranch, in ways that were transformative. She invested first in the farm, better equipment, improved water infrastructure, a proper barn to replace the linta she had been using. Then in the ranch, a new fence line along the eastern boundary that Raymond had needed for 3 years. Then in the community, in the small and practical ways that people with new resources often think about, she funded a lending library in the back of the dry goods store, which was a small thing that cost very little and mattered more to people than she had anticipated. She funded a year of schooling for Clara Sutter's younger sister, who was 12 and clearly intelligent and deserved an education. She thought about what her father had believed and what it meant to act on a belief. Their first child, a boy they named Thomas, arrived in June of 1876, 14 months after the wedding. He was born at the ranch with the help of the county midwife, Mrs. Alcott and Margaret Thatcher, who proved to be calm and entirely competent in a birthing room, which Nellie had suspected but was glad to have confirmed. Thomas came into the world loudly and remained loud for the subsequent months, which Nellie took as a good sign. Raymond held his son for the first time with the specific, careful wonder of someone who understands they are holding something irreplaceable, and Nellie, watching him from the bed with the exhaustion and the particular clarity that follows childbirth, thought that she had been right about him in every way that mattered. She told him this plainly, because she was Nellie Quinn, and she did not leave important things unsaid. He said, "I know I'm not wrong about you either." Thomas grew to be a strong child who walked early and talked even earlier, and showed at 3 years old an interest in the farm's water channels that made Nellie think, with a complicated kind of pleasure, that he might have inherited something from her specifically. He followed her around the fields the way children follow the parent they are most curious about, asking questions about the soil and the wheat and the irrigation, and she answered all of them honestly, which was both an educational approach and a promise to herself about what kind of parent she would be. Clara Sutter proved to be not only a competent farm worker, but a genuinely capable farm manager. By the second year, she was handling most of the day-to-day operational decisions for the Quinn homestead with minimal input from Nellie, which freed Nellie's attention for the larger questions. Nellie raised her wages twice in 3 years and gave her a formal title as farm manager, which was unusual for 1876, and which Clara received with a quiet pride that was the most gratifying response Nellie could have imagined. George Hennessy eventually went back to Iowa for his own reasons, and they replaced him with a young man from a recently arrived Bohemian family named Joseph Leineck, who understood wheat in a way that was almost instinctive and who worked with a cheerful diligence that made the farm pleasant to be on. The second child, a girl they named Margaret after Raymond's mother, arrived in the spring of 1878. Margaret Thatcher Sr. held her granddaughter for the first time and said nothing, which from her was the complete expression of emotion. She sat with the baby for an hour, and when she finally handed her back, she looked at Nellie with eyes that were very slightly brighter than usual and said, "She has your jaw." "Good," Nellie said. "She'll need it." Margaret Sr. laughed, which was rarer than her smile. Raymond, standing in the doorway watching his mother and his wife and his daughter in the same room, had the look of a man who understood that he was very fortunate and chose every day to be worthy of it. The ranch and the farm continued to grow alongside each other, two distinct operations with different characters. The farm precise and intensive, the ranch broad and patient, that complemented each other the way the two people running them complemented each other. They held the joint accounts Nellie had insisted on and reviewed them together monthly. They made major decisions together and minor ones individually, and the boundary between the two was occasionally contested and negotiated, which kept both of them honest and sharp. In 1879, Raymond was approached by a group of Caldwell County landowners to run for county commissioner. He was genuinely uncertain about it and talked it through with Nellie over several evenings. She told him what she honestly thought, which was that he was good at the things a commissioner needed to be good at, that his instinct for practical fairness was real, and that the county had recently had its land registrar convicted of fraud and could probably use someone in county government who was what they appeared to be. He ran. He was elected by a margin that surprised even the people who had suggested he run. The work added a new layer of demand on his time, which they had discussed and prepared for. Nellie took on more direct management of the ranch's cattle operations during the seasons when he was in Caldwell most often, which she found she had strong opinions about and turned out to have a genuine facility for. It was Raymond, in his second year as commissioner, who introduced a measure requiring all land transactions in Caldwell County to be reviewed by 2 independent notaries before filing a direct legacy of the Crane affair. The measure passed. It was a small reform in the context of the larger world and a significant one in the specific context of the county's history, and Nellie read the notice of its passage in the Caldwell Clarion with a feeling that was satisfying in a very deep place. Their third child, another boy named James, arrived in 1880. He was a quieter child than Thomas, more observant, more like Raymond in his pace and his way of watching before he committed. Nellie learned to read him differently than she read Thomas, which was itself an education in the particular individuality of children. She found that she loved the differences between her children as much as the similarities, which was something she had not anticipated, but which felt entirely right. The house had grown by then. Raymond had built 2 additional rooms onto the ranch house when Thomas was 3, and then a proper parlor when Margaret was born. And now, there was a real sense of a family inhabiting a space that was becoming the kind of home that absorbs generations. Nellie had brought her books from the soddy and filled 2 full shelves in the parlor with them, and the children's books lived on a lower shelf within their reach, and Thomas in particular was reading by 4 with an avidity that made Nellie think of her father at the Philadelphia kitchen table. She thought about her father often. She wished, in the specific way of wishes that cannot be answered, that he could have seen this. She thought he would have approved, not of the comfortable circumstances, which he had never particularly valued, but of the choices. The consistent choosing of the actual life you believed in over the easier available alternative. He had taught her that, and she had learned it, and she was teaching it to her children in turn, not through stated principles but through the visible evidence of her own days. Hannah Brower became one of the most important friendships of Nellie's adult life. They saw each other weekly through much of this period, and the friendship deepened the way close friendships deepen when both people are growing in real ways, not the same in the same direction, but genuinely alongside each other. Hannah had her own children and her own concerns and her own particular set of strengths, and she brought Nellie a warmth and a groundedness that complemented Nellie's intensity in ways she had not predicted. Ernst Brower and Raymond developed an unlikely friendship of their own over the years, two quiet, practical men who expressed regard for each other primarily through consistent availability and the occasional shared observation about the weather or the county government. Nellie and Hannah found this quietly amusing and agreed it was one of the more Kansan manifestations of male affection they had observed. The coal operation under the Homestead continued through the early 1880s, with the terms Nellie had negotiated holding firm. When the 10-year period came up for renegotiation in 1885, she renegotiated from a position significantly stronger than the first time, with Peters again at her side and a decade of careful record-keeping to support her position. The new agreement was better in every respect. She used part of the funds from it to endow a small scholarship at the new school in Caldwell for young women pursuing further education, which she funded quietly and did not discuss publicly because the funding was not the point, the education was. Thomas Thatcher, at 15, announced his intention to study engineering. Nellie took him to Wichita to talk to an engineer she knew from the Peters connection, and then helped him identify a correspondence course that would prepare him for formal study. She watched him pursue this with the focused determination she recognized in herself, and the patient thoroughness she recognized as Raymond's, and thought, there it is. There is what you get when two people build something together honestly. Margaret Thatcher Jr., who had her mother's jaw and a persistent habit of getting into arguments about anything she thought was unfair, grew to be a child who made both her parents simultaneously exhausted and proud on a regular basis. At 12, she was already reading everything on the lower shelf and had moved on to the upper shelves with no indication of slowing down. She had strong opinions about the inequality she observed in the world around her, which Nellie engaged with honestly, including the parts that were uncomfortable and not yet fully resolved. She did not tell her daughter the world was fair. She told her the world was a work in progress, and you were either contributing to the progress or you were not. James, the quiet one, turned out to have an extraordinary feeling for animals. He spent most of his time at the ranch with Raymond, learning cattle with the same instinctive patience Raymond had learned it from his own father. Raymond taught him carefully, and in his quiet way, completely. James received it the way he received everything slowly, deeply, durably. In 1884, Nellie sat down with her account books, all of them the farm accounts, the ranch accounts she shared with Raymond, the mining royalty ledger, the scholarship fund, and looked at the full picture of what had been built over 10 years. It was a real picture, not grand in the sense of wealth accumulated for its own sake, but solid in the sense of a life that had been deliberately constructed on principles she had chosen and maintained. The farm was productive and well managed. The ranch was healthy. The children were whole. The friendships were real. She sat with this for a long time, not with self-congratulation but with something more like wonder. 10 years ago she had arrived in Kansas with $73 and a stubborn conviction that the word person in the Homestead Act applied to her. It had seemed, at the time, like an argument. It turned out to have been a beginning. Raymond came in from the barn that evening and found her at the table with the books and a candle, and an expression he had learned over 10 years of careful attention to read correctly. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She told him. The honest version, the one that included the fear she had felt in the first winter and the loneliness she had not anticipated and the specific terror of the land office and the love she had not planned on and what it had become. He sat down across from her and listened with the full attention he had always given her, the attention that had never diminished, that she had noticed and relied on and loved as one of the core things she loved about him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You know what I think about," he said. "I think about you in that land office the day we met. Crane had forged your deed and sold your land, and you were standing there in that office telling him it was fraud by yourself, and you were right, and you were not backing down. I had it handled," she said. "You did," he said, and smiled the real smile. "I just wanted to see how it ended." She laughed. The same surprised laugh she had laughed that first evening, the one that had been one of the early signs that she was in trouble in the best way. He was still the person who could make her laugh like that genuinely, unexpectedly, with the specific quality of a laugh that comes from a place of real happiness. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you for 9 years, and I find that I love you differently than I did at the beginning, which is something I did not entirely understand was possible until it kept happening." "I know what you mean," he said. He took her hand across the table, the hand that had held a scythe and a pen and a legal document and a newborn child and 100 other tools of a real life lived in full. "I didn't know what love was supposed to feel like before you. I thought I did, but I had a smaller idea of it than it turned out to be." They sat together in the kitchen of the house they had built together, with the prairie dark outside and the children asleep in their rooms and the books on the shelf and the accounts balanced, and the fire in the stove doing what fires in good houses do, which is simply be warm. The years continued in the way years continue when they are filled with real things. Thomas went to the Kansas State Agricultural College in Manhattan in 1886, the first Thatcher to pursue formal higher education, and came home summers with ideas about irrigation, engineering that he and Nellie argued about happily and sometimes implemented. He was a young man who knew how to work and how to think and how to talk to people who were different from him, and Nellie watched him move through the world with the feeling of a teacher who has seen the lesson take root. Margaret Jr., at 17 in 1895, was already corresponding with women's suffrage organizations in Kansas and writing letters to the Caldwell Clarion under her own name about civic matters, which caused a certain amount of controversy in the county and no controversy whatsoever at the Thatcher Ranch, because both her parents read the letters and told her what they thought of the argument specifically rather than whether she should be making them at all. James stayed on the ranch, and by the time he was 20 was running the cattle operation in all but name, with Raymond stepping back gradually and gratefully into the advisory role that matched where he was in his life. Raymond was 50 years old in 1894 and still working, but beginning to think about what legacy meant in the concrete sense, what he would leave and what shape it would be in when he did. He and Nellie talked about this the way they talked about everything, directly, over time, with genuine listening on both sides. What they arrived at was a vision of the ranch and the farm operating together under the next generation as a combined operation, with Thomas's engineering knowledge and James's cattle sense and Margaret's administrative ferocity, all contributing to something that was larger than what either Raymond's family or Nellie's individual enterprise had been. It was a vision they had not been able to see at the beginning, when they were two separate operations and two separate people. It had emerged from years of proximity and genuine partnership, and the specific accumulation of trust that happens when two people consistently show up as they are rather than as they think the other person wants them to be. Nellie's homestead, the original quarter section above the coal seam, remained in her name. She had never transferred it. It was, in some way she could not fully articulate but did not need to, the marker of the starting point. the piece of land she had broken alone and defended alone before she learned that choosing partnership was not a contradiction of independence but a deeper expression of it. She walked the edges of it every spring, alone, in the April light. The winter wheat had given way to different crops over the years as she had learned the land better, and the water channel she had dug by hand in the first spring had been extended and improved twice. The soddy was long since replaced by a proper farmhouse used now by Clara Sutter, who had been the farm manager for 2 decades, and who had, in the fullness of time, married Joseph Leineck and had 3 children of her own, and run the Quinn farm with a competence and care that made Nellie feel she had made exactly the right choice in that early hiring. One April morning in 1896, 23 years after Nellie had first stepped off the stage in Caldwell and walked into the land office to file her claim, she walked the northwest corner of her property and stood where she had stood on the October afternoon when Raymond had asked her what she was going to do about the Hargrove offer, and looked south across the field. The green of the new growth was the same color it had been every spring. The sky was the same enormous sky. The meadowlark, or its descendant, was making the same sound. She heard Raymond's horse on the road and was not surprised when he slowed and stopped and dismounted and came to stand beside her, because that was what he did. "Annual inspection?" he asked. "Annual inspection," she agreed. He stood beside her looking at the field. He was 52 years old and the same person she had met in the land office except more fully himself, which was the best thing that could be said about anyone over time. "Do you ever think about what it would have been if you hadn't come west?" he asked. "Sometimes," she said. "I try not to linger on it. I think about what it would have been if I'd been at the land office an hour earlier or an hour later," he said. "If Crane had managed to file the transfer before you caught it, if you had been someone who gave up." "I was never going to be someone who gave up," she said. "I know," he said. "That's the part that haunts me pleasantly. There are a lot of ways things don't happen. There are so many ways things don't happen, and then sometimes they do." She took his hand. They stood together on the edge of her land, in the April light, looking at the green field and the enormous sky, and the long straight line of the horizon that Kansas gave you in every direction. The particular horizon of a place where you could see what was coming from far enough away to decide what to do about it. "I came west to be independent," she said, for the second time in her life to this man. But this time the words meant something different, or not different, but fuller. They had more years in them now. "I know," Raymond said. "And you are." She was. She had always been. That had not changed and had never needed to. What had changed was the understanding that being fully who you are does not require being alone, and that the right person beside you does not diminish your independence but witnesses it, which is its own kind of gift. They walked back down to the road together in the April morning, 2 people who had built real lives from real choices and real work and real love, and the meadowlark kept singing in the field behind them, and the horizon was very wide and very clear. Thomas came home from Manhattan that summer with his engineering degree and a young woman he had met at the college, a geography student named Rosa Fitzgerald, who had her own opinions about everything and made Thomas argue about them in a way his mother recognized immediately and completely. They were married the following spring in the same church in Caldwell, where Nellie and Raymond had been married 21 years before, and Nellie watched her son exchange vows with a woman who looked at him the way she had looked at Raymond, which was with clear eyes and genuine choice, and felt the specific happiness of a pattern that was being continued not out of repetition, but out of genuine understanding. Margaret eventually went to Lawrence to study at the University of Kansas, one of the first women admitted to the law program, which surprised no one who knew her. She came home for holidays with arguments and new books and a fierce intelligence that made the dinner table loud and very alive. She wrote letters from Lawrence that made Nellie think of her father's kitchen table in Philadelphia and the young woman who had read the Homestead Act by candlelight and found the word person. James stayed on the ranch and ran it with quiet authority and genuine love for the work. He was 20 years old in 1900, broad and patient like his father in his younger years, with his mother's precision applied to cattle the way she had applied it to wheat and to law. He proposed to a young woman named Adelaide Kowalski, the daughter of one of the Bohemian farming families that had settled in the county, in the late autumn of that year, and Adelaide proved to be the kind of steady, warm, deeply capable person who complemented James's quiet nature exactly. The ranch and the farm continued to operate together, as Nellie and Raymond had envisioned, managed by the next generation with the previous generation available and respected but no longer in charge. This was a transition that went better than many such transitions, because both Raymond and Nellie had been honest about what the transition needed to look like, and had held themselves to it. Raymond Thatcher, at 60, was a man who had become exactly what he had always appeared to be, which was increasingly rare. He sat on the county commission for 12 years and left it when he was ready rather than being asked to leave, and he left the county in better condition than he had found it, with the land registration reforms holding and a small tradition of civic honesty established that was fragile, as all such traditions are, but real. Nellie Quinn Thatcher, at 51, was a woman who had outlasted every prediction that had been made about what she could not do, which was not how she thought of herself, but which was how the county increasingly thought of her, not as a curiosity or a problem, but as a fact of the landscape, as permanent and particular as the prairie itself. They sat together on the porch of the ranch house one September evening in 1900, which was the turn of a century and the particular kind of marker that makes people look backward and forward at the same time. The children were grown and in their places. The farm was green and productive. The ranch was running well. The sky was doing what the Kansas sky always did, which was to be completely itself without apology, enormous and deep, and full of the particular light that Nellie had fallen in love with in her first spring on the prairie, when everything was hard and possible simultaneously. "Tell me something you're still curious about," Raymond said. It was something he asked her sometimes because he knew it was the question that reached her. She thought about it. "I'm curious about what Thomas's children will make of the farm," she said. "I'm curious whether Margaret will actually reform the Kansas Bar Association or just terrify it. I'm curious what James and Adelaide will name their first child." She paused. "I'm curious what the next 25 years will look like, which is not something I expected to be curious about. I expected by now to feel like I knew how things would go." "Do you want to know how they'll go?" she considered. "No," she said. "I want to find out." He smiled. She smiled. The September light came down over the prairie in the long, golden way that September has, and the meadowlark was doing its work in the field, and the children were grown and finding their own ways, and the land was solid under everything. And this woman who had come west to be independent was exactly that, and was also loved by a man who had understood from the first moment what that independence was worth, and had never asked her to put it down. This was not the ending of anything. It was the picture of a life in the middle of its best years, full of real things built on honest choices, held up by genuine love. The horizon was wide and clear in every direction. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.